Hey guys, and welcome to Studio Time. Today we're going to also talk about another theme of Justice League, the Zack Snyder cut, and it's the theme for Steppenwolf, Darkseid, and the Mother Boxes, and they're very much related to each other. But Steppenwolf is a character that we see the most in this film, instead of Darkseid and some of the other characters from that world. But Steppenwolf is a very tormented character, but he's also very dark in what he wants to achieve. So the music has like a weird dark quality to it, but it also has like some sort of an emotional quality to it, or a tormented quality to it. So I want to play you a piece of a theme, which is like 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes. This particular track was also released as one of the shortest singles, so I thought it was fun to analyze this. This particular theme actually plays quite a lot in the film. Not the same thing over and over again, clearly. But Steppenwolf is very important in this film, and Darkseid as well. I mean, consider it this way. He is the antagonist, but we have a bunch of characters that are the good guys, if you will. So I have to split up the themes between all these different characters, but there's only one antagonist. So it's that's why you hear it so much. Let me just play this thing, and then I'm gonna talk about it, what is going on in this particular piece of music. Here we go. Cool. So this is a short cue. It's the first time that we hear this theme. So I want to focus on one thing first, and that is the bass line. So this is the theme number 1, if you will, and it plays together with the cello, with the lower brass, but I did something with it, and I want to point that out in a second. So let me just play this thing. Okay, until here. So, but what I wanted, the bassist cannot play an octave lower, and you will not make classical musicians happy by detuning their godforsaken expensive instruments like a third down or a fourth down. They won't do it. I think there's like one piece, or there's probably more, but there's one piece of music that was performed 100 years ago where the composer asked the cello to tune their lowest note down to a B, and it was like a revolution, and people started throwing eggs and tomatoes at this guy. So they're technically not willing to do it. So if you do want that really low sound, that's where I record the basses and the cello in, and then I'm tuning them down to where I want them to be. So I did that, and then I doubled that with the synth bass. You see, we're going from A to A flat, to A to A flat. And this will give like a really low sound. Ah, this synth is not working. Maybe this synth is not installed on my system, and there we go. It's not installed, it's not working. Again, I did this from home. Let's see if there's something else that we can use. In the meantime, so I'm gonna unhide all my tracks and see if this thing is working. And this one is, so I'm just gonna copy this thing over here. This works. Let me just throw a filter on top of it to get that filter. Here we go. Simplon. I love that filter. So I have a really solid low end. I'm gonna turn it down a little bit. And let's see what happens. Yes, it's working. Now, what I technically did, and now I'm going to go data by locators, so I only see the tracks that I want to see. So here we see the basses and brass recorded. So if I zoom in a little bit, you can see it. Bass and brass recorded. So what I most likely did is playing the horns like right here. So this would be A1, and then I would transpose them down 2 octaves. And most likely I did this with the tuba and contrabass trombones as well, probably starting on the A0 and then going down an octave. And then I did it with the bass and the cello on pitch, most likely, also here, A1 and then 2 octaves down, and then I mixed it together with some plugins on it. Let's see what I actually put on it. Yes, and I showed you this plugin already. It's the decapitator. Here we go. So if I solo the bass and the brass, you could hear them on their own, tuned down to the A. Okay, so if I now add another bass track that I did with the live basses, and I'm adding this sub bass to it that we just played also separately, you get this really ominous, nice sound. And I'm gonna select the mixer window right here, and then I can do a little bit of like volume riding on it. Here we go. So you get that really nice growling, like dangerous sound that you could normally never get out of live players like that. I will explain to you in future tutorials like what I did with my jigsaw brass. I actually created a bunch of instruments because you're allowed to create to basically open up the limits of the instruments as low as you want or as high as you want. And especially as low is more successful, but because if you open up a tuba to like C6, it's gonna sound really weird, too much Mickey Mousing. But to open up a trumpet all the way down to to A-1 is incredible, the sound that comes out of it. So I'll show you that separately. And so it would be way easier for me to program something like this because I have special patches prepped for that. Let's see. So that is like a little bit of the sound design element of it. But let's just go back to the, let's open up the strings here, and let's play these. So it's a relatively very simple string arrangement, but a lot of it is filled with sound design, and we'll get to that later, and crazy choir. So let's just play this on its own. Okay, so now you see there's like two patterns here that we hear a lot. It's a da 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 da, and then that bass line. In future cues, a lot of those are just like reversed and kind of the same kind of tricks as with the Cyborg theme. In future iterations of this theme, a third melody, a fourth melody, and a fifth melody is being added, and then I use that same trickery as in the Cyborg theme. So I don't want to get into that technique right now, so please watch that episode for that particular technique. So now I'm just going to add the brass to it and the timpani, because they basically ramble along with the basses and the cello. So now that you see the timpani being part of it, and you see the brass being part of it, you see now some of these holes being filled with what wasn't there before. So let me play this for you again, and then you hear a very distinctive line of the horn as well, which is actually a melody that is also coming back as a separate catcher. So what you also hear is that it fills out really nice right now, but there's also like quite a bit of like extended harmony being used, where it's very hard to identify. It's like, oh, is that an A minor chord or a C major chord? This is all like very in flux, like what's happening. It's constantly tension, tension, tension. There's like major, minor, and then there's like augmented, and then it's like a fifth, and then it's augmented. So a lot of harmonies playing at the same time, and I like that type of color, and it reminds me a little bit of techniques that really brilliant composers have used 50, 60 years ago, like Max Steiner, Bernard Herrmann, but also some of the orchestral classical composers, pieces that I've studied a lot, and I've mentioned this before, Daphne and Chloe and The Rite of Spring. But there's so many pieces, Mahler, Bruckner, you know, composers that worked with really great forms of harmony and how they're distributed through the orchestra. So this is only a part of it. What is a really big part of the noise, if you will, is what I'm going to play to you right now. So these are recordings that I did separately. And these separate recordings resulted in a sort of like harmonic palette and a quality of sound that is in this movie constantly being mixed with the programming or writing, if you will, for Darkseid and Steppenwolf. So again, this was my demo. In this particular session, I will open up the mix session so you can hear how it sounds with real strings and real bass. So here we go. Let's just listen to these orchestral effects and choir effects that are live recordings too, but they were edited with audio. So in order to get this result, because these are real people singing, this is not like a weird simple thing. So let me just play one layer. And the idea being, you know, this is very much developed by people like Avo Pärt and Ligeti, and basically you start on one pitch, let's say C4 or C3, and these are all sopranos and altos, and so when you sing one pitch, they slowly start to drift to a different tone, but they can all pick their own drift, so it's not unison, which means that you get eighth tones, you get quarter tones, you get half tones, and everything in between, and that creates this really dense sound. And I started pianissimo, but when the big belching starts, it's fortissimo, and they all have to pick their own pitch, and so you can notate it as like a note, and then at a certain point you say like, okay, your range is maximum, let's say a 6. And you have to stay within that range, and you have 32 bars to get from unison to slowly start drifting, to more start drifting. And the maximum note length is reached at bar 32 with the maximum dynamic. We start with pianissimo, and you slowly get there. And female singers that are used to sing these choir pieces by these composers and many others, they understand what they're supposed to do. And so the notation to get this kind of result is actually very simple. And there's this great book, The Art of Orchestration, and there's also extended orchestration notation techniques. And you can read like how this is being done, the same as for strings and brass. There's all these experimental notations, but players and singers will know what is meant and how it's supposed to be done and how to do it properly to get this result. And obviously you have a conductor who can give extra directions when people are singing or playing. And at the same time, there's a composer, me, in the control room, who would then talk to my conductor and say like, I think we need to go more experimental here. can the top ladies get to this high pitch earlier than the lower sopranos when they're bending down? So there's all kinds of instructions that you can give, and they make quick scribbles on a piece of paper, and then they try it again. It's a wonderful way of recording, and I did these things separately. So with audio, I could layer it in where it needed to be used. So it's an interesting way of creating unique, scary colors for choir, for strings, and for brass. Now that we talked about the MIDI side of things, I would really like to play you now what the mix session sounds like. But before we do that, I'm gonna hit pause of some of my cameras that need a new memory card. See you in 5 seconds. Hey guys, the mix session is open, and I wanted to focus on the live recordings of the strings and the brass, and I want you to also hear how incredible these people sound. So let me play the brass, for instance, how great they sound. And these were 22 players. What a great sound, come on, it's incredible. So now let's take the brass out and let's just play these strings. Okay, here we go. See how they sound. Really wonderful sound. And what is actually funny is that with this particular score, I recorded a string group that was almost half of what I normally would record for a movie like this, because I wanted to hear more rosing of the bow when they're playing the notes. And you get a way more director sound because of it. And I really love the quality of that. And with brass, for me, that works a little different because there's nothing like a big heroic line, you know, on 12 horns. It's so fantastic, especially if you have a few choral elements underneath and they play 6 horns play the melody. I just love the sound of brass, and that's why I usually have a bigger brass group. In this case, also 6 trumpets. But the string section was relatively smaller. I also want to talk a little bit about what I have here. So these are my 2 FEP filter plugins that are on the master bus. So the session that is actually open currently is not the mix session that went to the stage where the movie was being mixed. This is actually a unique mix made for the soundtrack. I always mix the 2 separately. I first mix the film because I have a full dynamic range of the theatrical speakers, and I can play with things in surround and panning and things. For a stereo CD or Spotify or YouTube or Apple Music, wherever you might play your music, we're listening in stereo. So you have to reimagine what your mix is going to sound like. Also, the dynamic range of most speakers are not the same as a theatrical speaker system, so you have to bring the dynamic range down. So bringing the dynamic range down is partly done, most of it, I would say 80%, by doing different mix moves. So making sure that what is super quiet is mixed louder, and vice versa. Something that's super loud is taken down a little bit. So those are mix moves. And then at the very end of it, you want to make sure that your mix doesn't go over 0 dB, for instance. I use 2 plugins, and the 2 favorite ones for me for mastering are the Pro MB and the Pro L2, both made by a Dutch company. It doesn't get better than that. FabFilter, marked leader right now, in my humble opinion, when it comes to great sounding plugins, easy to work with, great presets for people that are not so experienced with it, and a fantastic sound. So let's just play this cue with everything on at the same time. And then we could see what these plugins are doing, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it. A simple thing is that we're looking at a multi-band compressor here. So they are the low frequencies, those are the mid frequencies, and those are the high frequencies. And my cutoff is around 90 Hertz here, and here a little over 2 kilohertz. So I use a relatively slow attack, a relatively slow release, relatively slow attack and release, relatively slow attack and release. So let's play this thing, and this limiter right there is set to plus 11.4, which is raising the input level of the input of the plugin. And then here we can see at the right side how much it is taking the peaks off the signal. So let's play this. You see that on the low frequencies, when the low drum comes in, you see that the low frequencies are being compressed a little bit. Now it starts to work more because we go to the peak of the track. I'm gonna stop right there. So there in the limiter, you saw that it took a few bits off, maybe like 1 to 2 dB on the real pick. But now you see like the mid frequency and the high frequency are now also doing a little bit of making sure that signal stays a little bit in control. So watch the low bands, the mid bands, and the high bands doing some compression when it's getting to a peak. So you see that when there's always, like, especially with live recordings, there and with a lot of programming, at certain frequencies there's certain peaks, and it becomes like a little too much, or a little bit like whoa, and very subtly you can compress that. So people who are looking at the ranges is that the mid band is compressing at the most 1.5 dB, maybe 2 on a peak, and the high frequencies around 1 dB or so. So it's very subtle. It's not like slamming it. Slamming can be great, you know, for electronic tracks, for rock tracks, and I've done that a lot in the past. But this is orchestral music. It's also film scores. So I'd still love to mix it loud and use individual compressors to compress drums and bass guitars and guitars and programming. But the orchestra, I'm relatively conservative with how much I'm slamming the orchestra. I usually like different types of plugins. There's a separate tutorial about that, which is dynamic EQing and something that is called upward compression, where a peak is not being compressed, but what is too quiet is raised in volume. Great videos also on the FabFilter website on these two particular things. I'll get to that in a separate tutorial when I show you what is different about my new template. So Guys, I hope you enjoy this episode about the theme of Steppenwolf Darkseid and the mother boxes with a short cue as an example. And we'll see you back next week for a new studio time. See you then.